All right, we are live. Um, Hello everybody. Here we are. Um, Here we are in our next week of our New Jerusalem discussion, and we're getting along in our book. And this week, our chapter is specifically in covering the subject of the church. And it's kind of interesting. I think of this whole book is about the subject of the church. The New Jerusalem is the vision of the new church. And now we kind of get a sort of a small, direct picture of what Swedenborg is talking about when he talks about the church. And it feels kind of providential that we're going to have this conversation. I'm going to have this conversation with my peer ear, the Reverend Shada Sullivan, a fellow clergy member serving the church on many levels, big old church buildings, church congregation, church life. Anyway, Shada, I think you and I, we talk each month about the ins and outs of this work, and so we're not talking about this theoretically. We'll have a lot of real lived experience to bring to it. So anyway, it feels appropriate for it to be you and me in this conversation. Although obviously there's a lot of others who care about this conversation. And Renee is joining us virtually. Good to see you, Renee. So what is the church? And uh I almost feel like this is one of those ones where maybe we could go paragraph by paragraph and maybe I would read it and then we can reflect on it because he's very succinct. The actual chapter is quite succinct and clear. And so maybe I'll just do that. I'll read the first one, 241. What constitutes heaven for us also constitutes the church. Just as love and faith constitute heaven, so too love and faith constitute the church. So we can see what the church is from what has already been said about heaven. That's a good place to start. how how do you feel, Shada, this resonance between heaven and the church? Sometimes I feel like we like to be a little realistic, like, well, no, the church is on earth. It's not always heaven, but where do you feel some synchronicity between these two realities?
Well, I think what it forces me to do is, and the way I appreciate what Swedenborg in general forces me to do, is that he often has such like much broader or mystical definitions of words, right? And so, like, are we using like sort of our popular conception of heaven and church and comparing those, or are we comparing like what Swedenborg is talking about when he says those terms, which is actually something a bit different? Because he defines then heaven being within us, that being, composed of the quality of our loves and affections and our thinking, and that coming together, offered in partnership with God, constitutes, our relationship with God. And so, and the church he uses in a equally mystical sense, right, to reflect something experiential. But also, it really hit me this time that actually he's talking about relationship, right? So I'm just like trying to, shift and really see what he's saying, that the church, the word that we give for either a building or an organization, in this sense, he's talking about a relationship, right? That the church is composed, so people have like an experiential relationship with God that they live into. And um, and that is part of what he uses the word church to describe within us. And then so church on earth is like a bunch of people coming together, having these individual experiences, and then having experiences together and in relationship. So it's like this dynamic collection of relationships to each other and to God. And this is what we call church. And I'm like, okay, that is interesting. Like, just that was just reflected a shift for the way not that I didn't understand it that way necessarily, but it just took on a new shape as I was thinking about it today.
It's beautiful. I love the way you articulate that. And it makes me think of last week we talked about heaven and hell. So one of the definitions of heaven in the chapter was every time we love what is good and true, we are in heaven. We are heaven. Heaven is in us. And so if the same is true for the church, that when we are loving what is good and what is true and understanding what is true, we are experiencing the church with them. We have this alignment between the divine and then we also get to do it together in this kind of web of connection. And ideally, or maybe not even ideally, like in reality, that's what the church is people living together in relationship, loving what is good and understanding what is true. And it does make as pastors in buildings and congregations, like that's quite a thing to hold, because that's not something that any individual has control over how that manifests. And even for an institution to have control over how that manifests. And I think probably a lot of people actually do have this understanding of church. I was just talking to my husband the other day about, we all recognize that, that goodness and truth happen within churches, but also outside of churches, and that falsity and harm happen within institutions and outside of institutions. So yeah, it's an everywhere kind of an invitation. That is beautiful and lovely. And I feel so gifted to be, I feel like it's new. And what Swedenborg is really, he's breaking a boundary around, it's a powerful charge to try to carry into the world in an institution that exists.
Right.
Sort of how to have humility, while also kind of owning that, well, goodness and truth is here too, anyway, yeah, it's yeah. Let's keep going. Let's read the next.
It's straddling. It is like straddling the natural and the spiritual in a way that sometimes is what sometimes is confounding, equally beautiful and confounding, right? Like when it's put in those terms of church is relationship and being in the midst of relationship. Like I think that gets to the heart of perhaps what we're called to as pastors, right? Like just like, oh yes, that's right. That's what I'm doing here. And then we just note all the way the different architectures and things, get built, programs, whatever, the things we use to mediate that or support that, relationship, are successful or not for whatever reasons. But I feel like that gets to the core of call, at least for people who want to lead a church, is to be like, oh, this is about relationship between God, relationship between people, and being in that and helping that grow. And I feel like that's a nice way to get to the heart of the matter. And then there's all the rest.
then there's all the rest. Yes. Oh, all the rest. It makes me think of, I was just presenting this morning about the Helen Keller Center, and I was she has a beautiful quote where she talks about how in her life, she always felt it less concerned about whether to work with Christians or Jews or Buddhists, but wanting to work with all people who wanted to suffering or lessen the suffering of God's children, and it's like, it's beautiful. And I think it's an acknowledgement of this web of connection and relationship that can exist within and outside of sectarian divides. And as someone now trying to create a new thing, and whatever Helen came up with to work with all that, then is also going to create a new structure that will have its limitations. I think there's there's sort of it's what we have to work with, the church, the structure, the organizations it's our best efforts thus far to gather, but how to live into this mystical vision is
Mhm.
not straightforward.
Right.
It is unwieldy and yet, beautiful. All right, so 242. The term church is applied to the regions where the Lord is acknowledged and the word exists. Since the essentials of the church are a love for the Lord that comes from the Lord and a faith in the Lord that comes from the Lord. And the word teaches us how we need to live in order to receive this love and faith from the Lord. This is where we start to get into some of the technicalities. We hear Swedenborg talk about how the church is this connection point between the divine and the natural. We hear this more mystical invitation that you've named, Shada, around people who are loving the good and understanding the true, kind of all over the place. And then also though does often make this quote that the church is where the word is, kind of where the word exists. And I wonder how you hold that, what that means to you.
Right. Well, I think sometimes Swedenborg shifts how he's using the word church and doesn't tell us.
Yes, that's a good point.
So he'll use it in this mystical way, and then he'll start sort of using it in a more earthly way. And so we're in this boundary where I can look at that and I'm like, okay, I can see on both sides where we expand it and where we contract it, right? And so, when he's saying acknowledge the Lord, right? Well, we can see that acknowledgement occurring under a God of many names, or even just a love towards making the world a better place, or the cause of love, right? All of those things will be an openness into which God will work, right? So that relationship, it exists. I think of the word as just one way that divine truth is an outreach of God, right? And so if the word is acknowledged, well, there are other ways to receive divine truth. So, I can see on this end, one end it can be expanded, this is what the church is, and on the other end it's sort of like, okay, well then this is what church is. And then it's like, well, this acknowledgement and this sacred scripture and this, and so sort of we go along our spectrum, and the definition or the way he's using it changes. And so we just have to be clear, like, what word is he using right now? And which one are we using? And so that will depend on how that will affect how we then read that.
Yeah.
Did any of that make sense?
It did make sense. And there's the sort of the universal church model versus the small,
Right.
specific,
Yeah.
there you go, church specific. And we're going to get into this next week. The topic is sacred scripture. So we'll get into a little bit more around that. So maybe we won't go too far down the rabbit hole today. I think, for me, I also think the way Swedenborg uses the word is, we have come to understand it after many, generations of being an institution as it's the Bible. And for some branches of the church, it's specific books of the Bible. It's this particular, canon. And the word, ultimately it's this logos, it's this kind of divine intelligence, or this stream of and it's a word that's used before this canon existed, so there's a lot of, in my mind, there's a lot of questions around that. And I think I also kind of come back to, and what Swedenborg is telling us is the reason the word is where we can connect to God is because it contains this inner sense, which is telling the story of our spiritual regeneration and of God's process of growth. So is it ultimately about that more than about the words or the canon or the way the Bible is?
Or
is it important that the Bible be up on an alt, and I think that Swedenborg probably would say any of those external rituals are not ultimately the church, but they are expressions of it, and they're kind of ways of finding it. And I think in this paragraph, the thing that strikes me is this kind of, the essentials of the church are a love for the Lord that comes from the Lord, and a faith in the Lord that comes from the Lord. And I find that very moving because to me, it speaks to that it's not something we ourselves actually manifest or acquire, that there's a part of the mystery of church is an acknowledgement that we are being formed by God and we are being drawn to God, and to be in community with others, making that acknowledgement is powerful. And it sort of speaks to, well, if God is doing that in us who are sitting together at church, God's probably doing that with the people outside on the sidewalk too. That there's an active way in which God is in relationship with us. And I find that very moving and important, especially when we're acknowledging we have no control. It's like, yeah, we don't have any control over this because God is actually doing it,
Yeah.
inside, gifting us the love that we have. And I think about that in terms of understanding, and I think this is emerging in a lot of places now, is like realizing, I think I used to think like, I know a lot of things because I've read a lot of books, and that's why I know a lot of things, like, or I've had a lot of good teachers. And on some level, that's true. But on another level, maybe I know a lot of things because this knowing, this logos is in me, is emerging in me. And I certainly recognize that I can read a book and it can mean very little, but then I can read something and something happens where I resonate with what I'm reading, and all of a sudden it means something in my heart. So there's a relationship between the two. And in the same way, we do not become faithful in church necessarily only because we have really good preachers and we hear lots of readings from the word and we do all of the right things, but because, as you pointed out, we're in relationship kind of with the people, with God. Something's happening in us and needs this interplay that happens. It's like, not that the word isn't important or the preaching is not important. But it's the relationship between the two, between our interaction with it and its offering. And ultimately, the person preaching, like, they may be saying lots of wise things, but they're giving something of themselves. They're showing up as another receiver of God's life.
Mhm.
And I feel like that relational piece is very powerful.
Yeah, for sure. And just the hallmark of any church like work, or as I think you're pointing out here, even though it doesn't say so explicitly, has to be humility, right? Like that what we're trying to cultivate is ultimately openness, right? And that we don't know how that's going to go. We know when it feels healthy, but we don't always know what it will produce. I mean, and it's just like one thing that like continually reminds me of this is that if I'm preaching, like I might have a sermon that I really love and I'm like, this is going to go over so well. And many times it's crickets, where other times I'll bring one and I'm like, oh, I don't like this one at all. And then people will be like, it was great. And this is what it did for me. And it's like, wow, I am not in control of that. Like that part that happens, I'm not in control. I bring my best efforts. And then God is doing the rest of the work in people. And I kind of love that juxtaposition of what church is. That the nexus of it all is something occurring, the alchemy of something occurring within a individual. But that we don't have to stay but that we get to do that in community as well, right? So we have both of those experiences, and that balance is so important.
Yeah, totally. All right, let's move on. 243. For a church to exist, there also needs to be a body of teaching based on the word, since without one, the word is not understood. Such teachings alone, however, do not constitute a church for us. That requires living in accordance with such teachings. It therefore follows that faith by itself does not constitute the church, but a church requires living according to faith, which means caring. And we've sort of been moving in this direction of this chapter, this paragraph, that ultimately it comes down to who we are and our love. I've really been thinking a lot about this. Like, I mean, words are important to me. I say lots of words, I read lots of words. I feel part of my ministry is being called to speak. You know, words are powerful. They have the power to affect, but like you're saying, that power is not, the power is in the effect, which is not ultimately in our control. And I've been thinking a lot about, like, as much as I think words can manifest change, it's really about the change. It's really about how we, I was sort of, I don't know, I was going through this thought experiment the other day of like, will my words matter? Like, do they do they have, you know, do they have life in them, kind of? And it's like, I think they only really have life in them insofar as they express something really true about me and build connection, you know? So like, because I've been thinking a lot about when I spout words and nobody is there to hear them, or there's not, you know, they're not, or they're not going, you know, the communication isn't happening, you know, that ultimately it's our life that speaks. You know, it's like, it's something deeper than they're just sounds coming out of our mouths. Like, if you didn't speak English, it would just sound like a bunch of jibber jabber. But could I still love you? You know, even if my words, I don't know. I think that's something about that that's important to hold, especially as for you and I, as people trying to be professional church leaders, is like realizing the place of words. Um, and Swedenborg, especially when he's so clear that it all comes down to who you are, how you're living in the world, how you're acting, um, how you're caring for others. And we can care for each other through our words. But they also can, I think we can get lost in them, I guess. I think we can sometimes get lost in thinking that they have more weight maybe than they do. What do you think? How do you feel about words? Do you think about
Oh
them?
yeah, definitely highly positive about words.
You're a fan of words. Okay,
I'm a
good.
fan of words, yes. Yeah, I enjoy words. I mean, I think that passage is speaking to like a real human reality. You know, like Swedenborg wasn't just like, you know, just in case saying this. He's like, he's noticing in the world of church and in religion. He's like, people are getting caught up and focusing too much on doctrine, and formulating doctrine and forgetting what it's for. And I think that's just a very human thing, because words are fun and ideas are fun, and putting together them like puzzles is fun, and like and the process, and I don't want to like be too dismissive, the process of feeling enlightened is amazing, right? Like putting things together, seeing how they make sense, you know, like all of that is such an important part of our spiritual work. It's just not the only part. It's only half of it, and, you know, to continue on the rest of it. So it's a warning, you know, to just be like, we know you like this part, but don't forget about this part.
He's probably speaking to himself too, because he certainly liked this part.
Yeah.
He was a fan of words too. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
All right, let's read the next paragraph. So, a genuine body of teaching is one focused on caring and faith together, and not one focused on faith by itself. Clearly, a body of teaching focused on caring and faith together is about how to live, while a body of teaching focused on faith does not include teachings focused on caring and is not. Yeah, that, you know, all of his works ultimately are about how to live, you know, and the Bible is all about how to live. And just like we're talking about it, there's this real warning of we can start to play in them. And I've been thinking about this. I'm trying to plan an event with my fellow Harvard chaplains who are of all different traditions. And I'm really trying to encourage people to come and share, you know, I want them to talk about love, their experience of love. And like, I feel like I want them to talk, like you can talk about what you've been taught about it or what your doctrines are about it, but it's got to come down to, and then how do you actually experience it? And how does it actually play out in your day-to-day life? And it's interesting to me. Certainly we have a lot of reports of the history of religion or theological debates where people are like fighting over doctrinal points that have very little bearing on anybody's actual life, you know, and fighting about how it's interpreted, or this doesn't quite mean this because I'm talking about this. And it's like, I think, and just like everything, there's a positive and negative, perhaps on one level. It's incredible that we have all of these words, like all of this differentiation, all of these different ways of communicating human experiences is incredible. And it's getting at nuances, you know, that wouldn't be able to be articulated otherwise. And it's so easy then to kind of get caught in the weeds and not be able to talk about the stuff that like really matters, or that we, you know, that we have in common. I think about that as sort of the challenge of our time right now, is we have so many different ways of articulating who we are. And it's interesting trying to branch out and like be in communication with people kind of outside of the Swedenborgian world. You note you don't notice how kind of siloed you are until you do that. And then people, I just don't even have any frame of reference for that word. That means nothing to me. And it's it's a problem that Swedenborg was, he foresaw 300 years ago, and it's even more of a problem now. What do you think in your experience? Do you have a sense of like what helps the words to come back to the caring? Like what helps to keep that caring kind of central, or
Hmm.
to keep the living central?
Well, I think it's helpful to like I like the way that it's stated in the passage that you read. Like it's not one alone, it's not either alone, it's both in partnership. And to note that they will, each part, faith and action or caring, will spur the other forward at different times, right? Like I'm thinking about the example that you gave about, you know, like religious councils getting caught up, you know, and I'm just like, okay, the reason that could happen though was because of some idea that was like, this is good, like this work is good, right? What would need to shift an idea where this work is good and we need other stuff too would have to come from a step back in caring, right? And, you know, so Swedenborg's dynamic vision of how human spiritual progress occurs, right? Starts from love, changes how we think, moves into action. And then that will probably, you know, cycle and cycle and cycle. It's sort of like a process of when you think it's one, it's always the other, right? Because that will just tell you what your next step forward will be. Which is, you know, disappointingly tenuous in practice.
It feels to me like it's all tenuous, but tenuous not in a impermanent way, but like just there's a holding lightly of externals that it feels to me like the new church is encouraging us, which is hard to articulate. I wonder sometimes, did our ancestors recognize this? Like why do we hold so tightly? You know, it just feels like that's a very hard move to make. And you know, part my effort with Be Love, Be Honest, Be Useful is very much about like, could we get to the heart of what the caring part is? Like, could we somehow like just really get clear on what we care about most? And then let the way we do that caring be different, you know, like, and yet it's very difficult because it does feel like often when we care about something, we care about it a certain way. And that's the way we kind of always want to hold it. And maybe that's just how we are as humans, and there's no way around that. But I do wonder, as ministers of the new church, you know, kind of charged with holding a vision that is in process right now, you know, that is not complete, that is on its way. There's a particular responsibility that we have to hold the tenuousness of it, you know, to not get lost in the, because when people do care about each other genuinely, it's a whole different way of being. But when we care about a form that we want to never change, that is a little less flexible,
Yeah.
a little less able to be transformed.
Yeah.
Let's continue because I want to, there's only
Well,
a couple more paragraphs and then we can talk about the whole thing as a whole.
no,
Um,
totally. Yeah, go ahead.
so people outside the church who acknowledge one God and in accordance with their religion devote their lives in some way to caring about their neighbor have something in common with people in the church, because no one who believes in God and lives a good life is damned. This shows that although the Lord's church takes a particular form where the Lord is acknowledged and the word is found, it actually exists everywhere in the whole world. Everyone in whom the church exists is saved, and everyone in whom the church does not exist is damned. Just got to get that in there for good measure.
Yeah, so
So that's the whole,
being
that's the
switching
whole
again
thing.
with how he uses the word church there, right? Even in
Yes.
one paragraph, his usage of the word church there shifts even within that one passage.
It shifts again. Yeah. Yeah. So there's ultimately this. So what are you charged to serve? What do you think our charge is? Is our charge to serve the particular church or the universal church? Or is it both?
Oh, I definitely think it's both.
Yeah.
Or at least for me personally,
Mhm.
right? I feel very connected to my tradition,
Mhm.
specifically because of the ways in which it feeds my my spiritual life, as well for the ways that it's been my ancestors as well, a lot of them coming through this tradition coming. So I feel connected to this tradition, but there's no way that I could feel okay with limiting my efforts towards to a tradition and only for that tradition, right? That that feels competitive, and right, like knowing that any work we do towards spiritual progress for humanity benefits the whole, right? That's just a goal that's sort of kept in a wider perspective, that which I think is supported by Swedenborg's universal vision, right? That there are so many churches that have arisen in the world, and of course we get pointy and judgy and say this one or that is better. But when Swedenborg talks about the universal church, right, the universal collection of people being in relationship with God somehow, um, that just seems, even if we don't think we're working for that, we are, right? Because it just, that's what God's plan is about, right? Just making more people, or helping more people be in relationship with God. And how that happens, I think we're a bit more picky about that than God is.
I love how you put that. I love how you put that. That's beautiful. Well, and that gets back to the church and worship as like all of life. So it's how we're living all of the time. So even if you are connected to a particular church with a particular tradition, it's still at play in your life if you're at the grocery store or if you're driving your car or you're picking up your kids. Um, and that's just, and so so in that way, we're always a part of this universal church. And we can also carry forward, because in some ways our tradition is just like any other beautiful effort that's been brought into the world. And if it's feeding us and we're enlivened by the people who we're carrying it forward with, it's good. If it's helping us to see and love what is good and to understand what is true, it's good, it's useful. And there's a invitation in that particular relationship to realize we're also in relationship with a lot of other people, a lot of other humans who are maybe organizing their lives differently. Robin makes the comment on Facebook, I feel called to serve both our church and the universal church. We call ourselves the new church, but we can't stay new all the time unless we evolve. Yeah, I definitely am stirred by the idea of new, and it's a funny name for a church. Certainly, you get like lots of jokes. I know when I served the Freiburg New Church, like, oh, how new is it? When did it? Well, it's been there since 1893. So, what does it mean to be new? What does it mean to be new all the time? To me, that's part of that invitation of the Lord is calling us. How is the Lord continuing to call us forward? And if we understand that this church is sort of first and foremost this relationship inside, we could be called to a lot of new things. And I think that's certainly my hope for us as a denomination, is that we can kind of honor the way we've been church thus far, kind of continue it insofar as it's going well and we are enjoying it, and kind of make space to imagine that there could be some new forms, new ways of being church that could thrive. And if we understand this universal perspective, then, everyone should be welcome in that endeavor on some level. There shouldn't be a sense of needing to exclude or indoctrinate people in a certain way before they're able to participate in the work of the church.
Yeah, I love the connection that you're making between newness and humility. Like that's that specific connection I'm making new in this moment. How important it is. Like, you can't be open to newness unless you're willing to let go of your conception of what is or needs to be. And so, it's just an integral part of the practice.
Yeah. I've been becoming very conscious of that we are kind of human animals and we like to feel safe. And I've become very aware of that just tendency and even in me, I mean, I haven't, I wanting to go to the same restaurant because I don't know if I'll like something at the other restaurant, or like wanting things to be familiar. And it's completely reasonable because life is crazy. And if you try to do too many new things at once, you get exhausted and you can't function. That we all kind of can handle a certain amount of newness and we need a certain amount of stability. And that's just what it is to be a human animal. And so I'm kind of aware of that in myself, and I'm just kind of really aware of it kind of globally, just and the amount of sometimes like suffering that we perpetuate because at least it's familiar. So it's easier to perpetuate something familiar than to really break out and move in that direction of newness. And I think that's something we as a church really, it's important to kind of honor that. And I don't know, that's sort of one of my other prayers for the church, is like, we can honor our need for comfort. You don't have to judge ourselves for that. We don't have to like condemn it. It's just like, yes, we need some things that are comfortable. But like, then we could all sort of maybe decide, all right, I need this much comfortable, and then I can start to grow here. And I think because there would be a healthy way to make more space for receiving this new vision, if we can sort of kind of honor our needs, not think that all of a sudden we're all going to be amazing and beautiful and totally transform everything and change everything all at once, and that's not even required. But my fear is that because we haven't been able to have this balance as much, we end up sometimes just falling into the trap of like not even considering the newness because it's just too threatening. So
I think we can ground all of that in the character of God, right? Because God is constantly, in the word, characterized as steadfast, right? Utterly steadfast. And yet God is also like, see, I'm doing this new thing too, right? So we have that balance within God's character, so that because God knows us and understands our humanity, and is like, knows that we need to have something to rely on, right? Something that feels safe enough so that then we can stretch and grow. And navigating that balance in church life, and just in a personal life.
Our personal life.
Right? So that is a huge balance, but it can't, like, God acknowledges that and says, my nature contains both fully. And so I feel like that's a wonderful way to sort of just be like, oh, okay. And as you were saying that, then I'm realizing, oh, okay, so steadfastness doesn't mean sameness, right? And so just being like, oh, okay, can I separate those two a little bit and just note, okay, there's some security that I'm looking for, and that's okay. Does that security have to come from, say, always having this thing or that thing be the same, or does it come from, can it come from something deeper, like my relationship with God, right, or my trust in God's nature or something else, so yeah, that's where my head's at on that for this moment. Yeah.
That's so beautiful, Shada. I think that you're hitting the core of the need of church. And that's the thing. I'm like, I think sometimes when I'm suggesting changes, people feel like I'm just going to throw it all away, that's where I'm suggesting we go. And I'm like, totally the opposite. Like, I think that there's a steadfastness that's so true and is always present. And that part of the job of the church is to name that and kind of be resting in that securely and steadily. And that the world needs that more than, I mean, it always needs it, but definitely now, like we need to know there is this steadfastness and this solidity, this eternal kind of reality that we are plugged into and that we are a part of. And it's the church's job to name that, to hold it, to make
Proclaim it,
space for it.
yeah.
Yeah, and that when we don't do when we equate the church with external forms that are fleeting or that are declining or that are, the paint is peeling, and people think that that's what the church is, then they walk away. And they don't, and it somehow that steadfastness is lost, and I feel like that's the tragedy. That's sort of the heartbreak of these changing times, is there's sort of this loss of this awareness. And even on a broader scale, I think about like kind of the loss of a sense of what the truth is, or a loss of sense of, that some of that wandering is like, it's actually pointing to a reality, which is all truth is an appearance and everything is a little bit, not total, but it's losing sight of this deep groundedness in, we are alive and we are creatures who bear children and love each other and build community and need one another and are so blessed to be alive. Like that there's this, it loses sight of this sort of the steadfastness. And then it also kind of discounts the kind of the great ones who have given us wisdom over the years that have helped us to affirm that steadfastness. And I feel like there's something about the truth, something about love that we are charged with holding. But if we hold it too tightly, then it just becomes about the ways we're holding it.
Mhm.
And yeah. I don't know. I don't know what to do with all of that sometimes, but I think maybe none of us need to know, and maybe that's partly where this moment is bringing us back to the first place where the church lives, which is,
Mhm.
as long as you can hold on to your steadfastness, I'll hold on to my steadfastness. And then I do think what happens is when we gather together, or two or three are gathered, if we can it grows, it actually expands. And there's my husband's been going through a really hard thing lately, and I've been kind of actually in a good place. And it's like, I see how we kind of we take turns like losing the steadfastness and pulling each other back. And I think churches can do that as well. And there's a real invitation to trust that God is still doing something, and that it's okay, even as our plans or our wishes of how it would all be are maybe not in alignment. Mm. So what do you want to do? How do you want to be a church, Shada? Are there like what's feeling like church to you right now? I guess maybe that's my question. What's
Mhm.
feeling good and feeling what's helping you to feel that steadfastness in your day to day?
Yeah. I think I'm learning as I pastor in is just learning or relearning or learning in new ways the value of community. You know, as someone who as an introvert, this is not necessarily like a intuitive kind of lesson. Um, or always grappling with the balance of separateness and community. And, you know, and I think an introverted person might just sort of by default go to the separateness part of it. Because many times in this world, if one doesn't actively do that, it disappears. Right. So I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but at the same time, I think there are times where because of my nature, I discount the value of community. Um, uh, and I do still need it. And I do still, because my natural inclination is to privilege or just gravitate towards singular experience. I've just appreciated the learning of all of the beauty and joy and growth that comes from being in community. Just the warmth of it and the joy of it and the surprise of it, as well as the steadfastness of it, right? The ways in which we can relax into community, um, the ways in which it makes us accept humility because things happen that we don't expect, that God works in community in ways that we don't expect. So I think for me, like that's when I think about why church, like I could be happy on a, deserted island with my stack of the writings, reading and making notes and proclaiming the joy of knowing a God that has designed such amazing things. But that's just not, that's only a part of what God has designed. And God has designed us to be in community together. And what I'm learning by being church and working to lead church is just, I'm just seeing that be expressed and like, oh, right. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, God. I'm learning this other part of your vision that I see how important it is. I see how integral it is, and how beautiful it is. So I think for me, that's why I would show up to church, why I work for church to succeed as an idea. um, uh, because it's a container for our relationships with each other. And um, and if we don't, like, God can only work really into the containers we provide, right? Whether it's our open heart or our open spaces or our, and I know for myself, being a risk averse, as I said, introverted person, I'm naturally going to contract those spaces. If it's not my heart, I might contract my social spaces or my, and I know God has a lot more to give than what's in books. And so, yeah, that's the biggest learning that I see and the biggest value I see for church. And as you said, like figuring out what containers exactly we create in order to hold this openness for relationship with God and each other. I think that's definitely open for debate, but the work of creating them, I think, is worthy and good. And so I'm here for it.
Me too, Shada. Me too. I like that. Oh, that's so I feel like you're getting a little extra divine intervention today. You're just your words after all of our negative attitude about words. Your words are beautiful. I'm here for it too. And I mean, that's why I'm in this business, is being in community with others and feeling the experience of being loved by others and sharing that love. And I think one of the things I'm wondering about, or becoming kind of conscious about, is just how hard it is. You know, there's sort of a lot of people, I feel like there's these like t-shirts, like people are the problem. Like if there were no people, everything would be great. Like there's sort of this funny, we're getting more honest about the problems and the challenges of being together. And that's, and I'm kind of aware of that very acutely. And feel like that's part of this moment, and part of the new church moment is like people for many generations figured it out because there were sort of strict codes of behavior based on your status and where you were. And, you know, like, so like, I think maybe relationships went a little more smoothly because everybody dressed a certain way when they went into certain situations, and you didn't speak to your elders, and this was the person, you know, there were a lot of hierarchies and kind of models of authority that played out in different settings. And that's how cultures manage things. It's how, you know, things, and that we're in a new era, you know, where that a lot of that is broken down. And so there's sort of like this new freedom to be in relationship with a lot of diverse humans, but we don't really know how to do it. We don't have any training or any, you know, so like, I just feel like for me, the new containers I want to create is like acknowledging that it's really hard, that it's not going to be automatic, that there isn't a code, you know, the unspoken code thing doesn't work anymore. So if there are going to be codes of behavior, we need to say it out loud and write it on a big poster board. These are the things that are okay, and these are the things that are not okay. Like that we're in a new phase of having to name boundaries and clarify what's in the container, what's okay, what isn't okay. And I feel excited about that. It's work, it's exhausting, but it also feels like it's an opportunity to gather in different ways with different people who maybe wouldn't feel drawn to gather in the old ways, you know, and I feel like a lot of our communities that maybe are breaking down because they still insist on kind of living by the unspoken rule, and that just doesn't work. You know, it's not yeah, the only way that works is if you have this generation trains the next generation, which trains the next generation, and they all just keep doing the same thing. That's how it works. But that's kind of broken down. I mean, the churches I've served, the grandparents are there and the little kids are there, but the middle people in the middle are not. You know, there's that way of passing down knowledge or behavior has shifted. And we can mourn that. We can wish it were not so, but it's just what is. So now what will we do, and how will we create containers where we can really have all of the beautiful things you named about community again, in new ways and with new mixes of humans.
Right. Well, because many of the containers that human beings have made over time have been so rigid and were made for the purpose of keeping people out, right? As well as keeping people safe within. And so I'm just like noting using even that word. I'm like, oh no, does that mean it's too insular or, you know, too gatekeepy or right? But when I use the word container for relationship or, you know, or form, I'm thinking more in terms of like, say, a cell membrane, right?
Yes.
A permeable membrane that things can flow in and out, but it still holds enough of a shape, right? A shape to allow for the space of something without being so rigid that it doesn't include everyone. So but again, still.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think that's one of my favorite parts of Swedenborg is the describing heaven as a body, God as a body, all of us as parts of the body. I mean, that's a really live and beautiful metaphor because we do need forms. We need roles. We need to know what's required of us. We need to know what's okay. It's terrifying to not have those things. And I think a lot of us are a bit terrified right now in the world because a lot of those roles have broken down. So I think it is, yeah, the new church is not an end to all roles, an end to all diversity, an end to all ritual, or not at all. If that would just, that's sort of the white room, model of diversity, which nobody wants, It's got to be, and a lot of the creative things that have happened in the world are different types of humans gathering together and forming new identities and new schools of creativity. And, I think we need each other. We need to find new ways of belonging and creating space and it's not about right but to do that without it being, we're going to be the best and you're the worst, or we're going to, without being in competition with each other. But I feel like in a lot of ways the world is being remade, we are being remade, culture is being remade, the church is being remade. And it looks like a lot of chaos, but I think I take comfort, especially where we started the conversation, that, the church is where we love what is good and we understand what is true. Like all humans have the ability to look out at their life and love the good of life and seek to engage it from this position of truth. And every time we do that, we are being the church, and we are being the church, and whenever we can do that together, even better. And that there's sort of these webs of connectivity and relationship that are present and that are being nurtured and cared for, and that's incredibly hopeful and incredibly helpful to hold on to when it feels like things are chaotic.
Definitely. I appreciate you circling it back right to the beginning, because it just, again, using that mystical sense of the word church, it's making a declaration of what is. The church is, it doesn't matter what we call it. Like I find comfort in that too, just this sense of like, oh, okay, like that's, uh people's relationship with God exists, and that's what God is working into, and we will give it various names and we'll make various containers. But while we work in partnership with God, I'm not sure we have control enough to, have anything to do or any way affect, right, that more existential sense of the church is, right? It exists, and we'll continue to just, try to figure out different ways that we can help support it and create space for it. But it is comforting to me to recognize that it's not work, like its creation is not work that I am even allowed to do.
Right. And I think as members of a denomination that is struggling, like most denominations, I think it's incredibly powerful to, like, could we all like stop being afraid? Like could we all rest in the steadfastness that we're naming right now? And if we rest in that steadfastness and we don't operate from fear, which in my experience just makes us kind of want to cling and want to sort it out and figure out all the answers, like I just feel like I wonder what I think we're in a more powerful stance because we're actually accepting what is true, instead of denying it or trying to spin it. And in that truth, what might God be doing, and for a lot of other denominations who are struggling, their theological frame is like, this is the church, this is what God wanted. But I think we have an opportunity to be like, we don't quite know yet. Like it's a new thing. So we have even more encouragement, I think, to hold it lightly, not reactively, not any which way, but just lightly, faithfully, and steadfastly, as you've pointed out. Yeah, good stuff. Well, it's been good to be in this conversation, and thank you everyone for joining us online and for all of the ways that each of you are the church. And next week we'll be gathering to have our conversation around the sacred scriptures and the word. So I hope you will join us then. All right. Bye, everybody.